Of course, here is the translation of the script into English, adapted for a natural-sounding voiceover. When we hear the name Leo Tolstoy, a familiar, majestic image instantly comes to mind. A long, gray beard, a piercing, all-knowing gaze from under thick brows, and a simple peasant shirt. We see the patriarch of Russian literature, the sage of Yasnaya Polyana, an unshakable giant who gave the world colossal works like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. His name is synonymous with classic literature, a cornerstone of world culture. It feels like we know everything we need to know about him, a genius, a humanist, a philosopher. But what if this classic portrait is just a convenient screen, hiding a completely different man? A man far more complex, contradictory, and even dangerous in his beliefs than we're led to think. To begin uncovering this, we don't need to search for secret archives or classified documents. We just need to listen to the words Tolstoy himself said about his greatest creations. Imagine, it's only a few years after the titanic labor of writing War and Peace. The novel is a sensation, read and discussed all over Russia and praised by critics. You'd think the author would be basking in his well-deserved fame. But in January 1871, in a letter to his friend, the poet Afanasy Fet, Tolstoy wrote a stunning phrase. "How happy I am that I will never again write such verbose rubbish as war." The word rubbish used to describe his own masterpiece, which many consider the greatest novel of all time. Perhaps it was a moment of doubt? The fatigue of a genius after immense strain? Not at all. This was the birth of a new Tolstoy, one whose opinion would only grow stronger over time. Decades passed. The 20th century is on the horizon. On December 6, 1908, nearly 40 years after his letter to Fet, the 80-year-old writer noted with bitterness in his diary, "People love me for those trifles, War and Peace and the like, which they consider very important." Trifles, trivial things, the very works that brought him worldwide fame he considered insignificant nonsense. The most vivid illustration of this attitude came a year later, in the summer of 1909. A visitor to Yasnaya Polyana, overcome with emotion, began to fervently thank the classic author for creating War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Tolstoy's reply was calm but devastating. That is like someone coming to Edison and saying, "I greatly respect you for being a good mazurka dancer. I attach importance to my other books entirely." What could have happened in the mind of a man who reached the pinnacle of literary fame that he could so easily dismiss the very things that made him immortal? What other books, and more importantly, what ideas became more important to him than global recognition and the love of millions? The answer isn't found in literary debates. It lies in the realm of ideas. Ideas so radical, so uncompromising, that they brought him into direct conflict with the two great powers of his era, the church and the state. These were ideas that, even in the 21st century, the Russian judicial system has 3 times declared extremist.
Ideas deemed extremist. Today, that phrase conjures images of political radicals, but in Leo Tolstoy's case, we're talking about a different kind of extremism, an extremism of thought, an uncompromising honesty that proved so explosive its echoes are still felt today. His conflict with the system didn't begin with obscure articles, but with a blow to the very heart of the Russian Empire's spiritual authority. In 1901, the Most Holy Synod, the highest governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, officially announced that Count Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy was no longer a member. This wasn't a simple reprimand, it was an excommunication, an anathema, essentially a declaration of spiritual war on the most famous and respected man in the country. To millions of believers, he was declared an enemy, a heretic whose books were a source of temptation and destruction. It would seem that the story of his confrontation with official religion could have ended there. But Tolstoy's ideas proved so resilient and sharp that they outlived the Empire and the Soviet Union, only to find themselves back in the dock. Let's jump to the 21st century. In March 2010, in a court in the city of Yekaterinburg, an expert on extremism, Pavel Suslov, gave an official conclusion. He testified that Leo Tolstoy's leaflets, specifically his Preface to a Soldier's Memo and an Officer's Memo, contained direct calls for inciting interreligious hatred against the Orthodox Church. Works written over a century ago once again became the subject of legal proceedings. But the most astonishing event happened a little earlier. In late January 2010, the public learned of a court ruling in the Rostov region from September 11, 2009. During an anti-extremism trial, a verdict was issued that sounds like an absurd joke. The official court documents mentioned the writer Leo Tolstoy, a male, born in 1828, Russian, married, place of residence, Yasnaya Polyana, Tula region. This man, long departed from our world, was officially declared an extremist. The basis was an expert report that identified the extremist nature of Leo Tolstoy's worldview, which incites religious discord and hatred. So what exactly frightened the justice system in the 21st century? What statement from a count who lived in the 19th century could possibly incite hatred today? Well, here it is, the seditious statement that formed the basis of the charge. I have become convinced that the doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church is a theoretically cunning and harmful lie, and practically a collection of the grossest superstitions and sorcery, which completely conceals the whole meaning of Christian teaching. The court ruled that this phrase creates a negative attitude toward the Russian Orthodox Church, and on this basis, the article containing the statement was declared extremist material. And so, the great writer, humanist, and philosopher became not just an extremist, but a repeat offender, condemned in both imperial and modern Russia.
However, Tolstoy challenged more than just the church. He saw it as merely one of the pillars of a system that he believed was based on violence and deceit. And he unleashed his most furious, most merciless anger on those at the top of this system, the rulers, to whom he addressed words filled with righteous indignation. His ruthless criticism of the church was just a prelude. Tolstoy saw the church not as an independent evil, but as the spiritual justification for the evil of the state, a system built on coercion, hierarchy, and ultimately violence. And when this state violence reached its peak in the early 20th century, he could no longer remain silent. At the time, the Russian Empire was shaken by revolutionary turmoil. In response, the government acted with extreme brutality. The head of this response was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, a powerful and controversial figure. After a failed assassination attempt on him in August 1906, a system of field courts-martial was introduced across the country. These were justice assembly lines, operating with horrifying speed. A verdict was delivered within 1 or 2 days and could not be appealed. Execution followed immediately. Among the people, these courts and their consequences earned grim, dark-humored nicknames. The noose, the primary method of execution, was called Stolypin's necktie, and the gallows themselves were known as Stolypin's swings. The country became covered with these monstrous structures, and for Tolstoy, each act was not justice, but a cold-blooded, legalized killing that he saw as a moral catastrophe. It was then, shaken to his core, that he wrote one of his most wrathful and accusatory articles, "I cannot be silent." It is a cry of conscience, a desperate appeal to humanity, addressed not to an abstract society, but to the specific people in power. He speaks to everyone involved in the process, from the rank-and-file executioners to those giving the orders. But he directs his main blow at the very top of the power pyramid. He writes an open letter of unparalleled audacity. In it, he addresses the Prime Minister and Emperor Nicholas II directly. "I appeal to all of you, from those who lead men to the gallows and place hoods and nooses on people, on brothers, on women, on children. To you, the 2 main hidden executioners, who through your complicity participate in all these crimes, Pyotr Stolypin and Nicholas Romanov. Come to your senses. Think again. Remember who you are. Understand what you are doing. For before you are executioners, prime ministers, czars, you are first and foremost men and brothers of men. Today you have seen the light of day. Tomorrow you will be gone." Just think about those words. A count, a subject of the Russian Empire, in print calls the head of government and the autocrat, God's anointed, the main hidden executioners. He doesn't ask, he doesn't plead, he demands that they come to their senses, reminding them of their human nature and the inevitability of their own death. This wasn't just a political statement. It was an act of the highest moral accusation thrown in the face of the entire state machine.
Such fearless, uncompromising criticism of power and the church couldn't have come from nowhere. It was based on a completely different, hard-won worldview. To reject the existing order with such force, one needed an incredibly strong foundation of faith in something else. Having rejected orthodoxy, which he considered a distortion of true teaching, and having challenged the secular power, which he saw as a machine of violence, where did this lonely seeker of truth turn his spiritual gaze? Where did he find the support that allowed him to stand alone against an entire empire? His support was not a new dogma, but a return to the original sources of wisdom which he sought all over the world. His break with the Orthodox Church was not an act of disbelief, but an act of the deepest faith, a belief that the true teaching of Christ had been distorted and replaced. In his 1907 article, Why Christian Nations in General and the Russian People in Particular Are Now in a Dire State, he formulates his position with extreme sharpness. He declares that the church faith, professed by millions for centuries under the name of Christianity, is nothing other than a very crude Jewish sect. He immediately clarifies this shocking definition. According to Tolstoy, the teaching that formed the basis of the church is not the teaching of Christ himself, but the teaching of the Apostle Paul as laid out in his epistles. And this teaching, the writer believed, is the direct opposite of what Jesus taught. He gives examples. Christ says that people should not expect rewards and punishments in the future, but should fulfill their purpose here and now. Paul's teaching, on the contrary, is based on fear of punishment and promises of ascension to heaven. The gospel says that all people are equal, but Paul acknowledges slaves and tells them to obey their masters. Christ teaches not to resist evil with violence, while Paul says that a ruler is God's servant for your good, thereby justifying state power. Having rejected what he considered a distortion, Tolstoy began his own global search for truth. He immersed himself in the study of the great philosophical and religious texts of the East. His library at Yasnaya Polyana was filled with the works of Western philosophers, but alongside them stood the teachings of Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha, and Muhammad. He delved especially deep into ancient Indian philosophy, studying the Vedas and other sacred texts. This was not just an academic interest. Tolstoy saw in Eastern wisdom the same universal ethics he found in Christ's Sermon on the Mount. He was so captivated that in the 1870s, while compiling his books for children, he included Indian fairy tales, fables, and parables, introducing Russian peasant children to the wisdom of a distant civilization.
It was this interest in India that led to one of the most astonishing and unexpected dialogues in history. In South Africa, a young Indian lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, fighting for the rights of his countrymen, became fascinated with the Russian Count's works. Tolstoy's ideas on nonviolent resistance to evil had a stunning effect on him. Gandhi wrote, "I studied Tolstoy's works assiduously. His books made a deep impression on me. I came to understand more and more the limitless potential of love." A correspondence began between them. The old sage from Yasnaya Polyana and the future leader of India's national liberation movement discussed how to fight an occupying government without using force. Later, Gandhi would strongly recommend that his followers read Tolstoy's works. And so, the ideas of a Russian thinker, born in the quiet of his Tula estate, crossed oceans and became the philosophical foundation for a movement that ultimately led to the liberation of an entire country. But for Tolstoy himself, it wasn't enough to simply believe, write, and correspond with great minds. He was a man for whom a thought not put into action was dead. He couldn't just declare his ideals, he had to live in complete accordance with them. And it was this desperate, uncompromising attempt to turn his own life into a manifesto of his beliefs that turned his final years into a true drama and his family into a bitter battlefield. For Leo Tolstoy, it was not enough to simply arrive at the truth. He had to become its living embodiment. A thought not backed by action was, to him, hypocrisy, the most terrible of sins. And so the Count, the aristocrat, one of the wealthiest men of his era, began to systematically dismantle his own life to build a new one on its ruins that matched his convictions. This transformation was not just internal, but deeply external, visible to all. He, whose ancestors were pillars of the empire, voluntarily began to lead a lifestyle close to monastic asceticism, striving to become simpler and closer to the common people. Luxurious aristocratic clothes were replaced by simple peasant shirt. He began to walk barefoot on the grounds of his estate, seeking a literal connection to the land. In his later years, following his principle of nonviolence, he completely gave up meat, becoming one of the most famous vegetarians of his time. He performed physical labor alongside the peasants, plowing the land and mowing grass, believing idleness and wealth to be the source of evil. This gray-bearded patriarch, known throughout Russia, consciously erased the line between himself and the common man, trying to prove in practice the equality of all people. However, if these personal ascetic practices only caused bewilderment among his circle, his next step sparked a real war in his own home. Tolstoy came to the conviction that property, especially intellectual property, was evil. He decided to renounce the copyrights to all his works created after 1881.
This meant giving up enormous royalties, which were the main source of income for his large family. And here, his ideals clashed with harsh reality in the person of his wife, Sofia Andreevna.
For her, this was not a matter of philosophy, but of survival and the future of their children. She was not just a wife, but the manager of a huge estate, a mother who saw her duty in providing for her family. And she rebelled against her husband's decision. It was a brutal conflict of two truths. He was fighting for the purity of his teaching and the salvation of his soul. She was fighting for the well-being of her children and the preservation of their home. Years of arguments, reproaches, and mutual misunderstanding followed. Eventually, a difficult compromise was reached. The copyright was removed from works created after 1891. A request was included in his posthumous publications for publishers to initially refrain from releasing cheap versions, so the family could earn money, buy back the land of Yasnaya Polyana, and, according to Tolstoy's will, give it to the peasants. But this concession brought no peace. The tension in the house grew daily. Sofia Andreevna, fearing for her husband's mental health and expecting more unpredictable actions from him, began to literally watch him like a small child, controlling his every move. For Tolstoy, his own home, his beloved Yasnaya Polyana, had become a golden cage. He felt like a prisoner, and his life a monstrous lie. He preached the rejection of wealth while living on a count's estate. He spoke of freedom while under the constant surveillance of his own wife. This internal torture became unbearable. He started a new, secret diary, which he hid from everyone, entrusting his suffering only to paper. Finally, he realized he could not go on like this. The chasm between his teachings and his life had become too wide, and to remain true to himself, he decided to take the most desperate and final step of his life. The point of no return had been crossed. The internal conflict had reached a line where compromise was equivalent to self-destruction. For Leo Tolstoy, life at Yasnaya Polyana, under care and surveillance, in a luxury he despised, had become unbearable torture. And so, he made his decision. The deep, cold night of October 28, 1910, became the time for action. In the silence of the house, broken only by the creak of floorboards and his own breath, the final drama of the great writer unfolded. The movements of the 82-year-old man were hurried and secretive, like those of a fugitive. Accompanied only by his doctor, Dushin Makovitsky, he packed the bare essentials to leave forever the world that had created him, and which he had so desperately tried to remake.
Before leaving, he left a farewell note for Sofia Andreevna on the table. It was a document full of pain, love, and unshakable resolve. He wrote that he could no longer live a life that contradicted his beliefs, that his actions would cause her grief, but he asked her to understand, and most importantly, not to look for him. He was not running away from his family, he was running toward himself, toward the ideal to which he had dedicated the last decades of his life. He wanted to travel to the southern provinces, to lose himself among the common people, and there, in obscurity, begin the peasant life he had written so much about. To disappear into nowhere at the age of 82, to finally find harmony. The journey began in a cold third-class railway car, among ordinary people who had no idea who was traveling beside them. But this escape to a new life soon turned into a journey to the final threshold. The damp autumn chill, the drafts, and the harsh travel conditions took their toll. The old man's body could not withstand it. On the road he began to feel ill. Chills racked his body, and a high fever set in. It was clear he had pneumonia. The journey had to be cut short at the very next station. That station was a small, unknown dot on the map called Ostapovo. Here, in the modest house of the station master, Ivan Ozolin, the great writer's earthly journey was destined to end. News of Tolstoy's whereabouts spread like wildfire around the world. The tiny station became the center of global attention. Journalists from all over, government agents, relatives, and followers flocked there. Everyone awaited news from the little house where the man who had challenged an empire was fading away in a feverish delirium. For 7 days, the entire planet held its breath following this slow departure. His physical decline was as unusual as his life. It happened not in his ancestral estate, surrounded by luxury, but in a state-owned house, to the sound of passing trains, a symbol of the very progress he so often criticized. He left the world at a crossroads, on a journey, never having reached his final destination, but remaining true to his last impulse. It was an ending worthy of his restless soul.
But the story didn't end there. His physical body was gone, but his will was stronger than ever, and his funeral became the last and loudest statement he made to the world, a statement made in complete, deafening silence. Tolstoy's final will was as uncompromising as his life. He had given instructions for his farewell to the world, and his wishes were carried out exactly. The procession that carried his simple wooden coffin from Yasnaya Polyana to his final resting place was thousands strong, yet it was deafeningly quiet. In this silent march, there was nothing of the lavish aristocratic funerals. There was not a single priest in robes, no funeral prayers were heard, no icons were seen in the crowd, and no church candles burned. It was the final and most visible rejection of the church system he had fought so fiercely throughout his conscious life.
He chose the place for his final rest himself, and it was deeply symbolic. It was not a church cemetery or a family crypt. His grave is on the edge of a ravine, in the quiet woods of the old Zakaz forest. According to family legend, this is where his older brother, Nikolai, as a child, had buried a green stick on which the secret to universal happiness was written. He willed to be buried right there, where he believed as a child the key to freeing humanity from all suffering was kept. And today, if you visit this place, you will see nothing to suggest the grave of a world-famous genius. No granite monument, no bust, no headstone with a name and dates carved on it. Just a small grassy mound under the shade of the trees. It is perhaps the most modest grave of a great person on the entire planet. A simple green hill of earth. This is his silent testament, the final and most powerful symbol of his teaching. A complete and final break with the system he rejected, a renunciation of posthumous fame, and a return to the simplicity and nature in which he saw the highest truth. A grave without a cross became his final manifesto. Now, having walked this path, the initial polished image of Leo Tolstoy, the gray-beard sage and author of great novels, seems incomplete, like a faded photograph. It is shattered. In its place stands a figure far more tragic, powerful, and relevant. A radical thinker whose ideas of nonviolence inspired Gandhi and changed the course of world history. A fearless critic of power who was not afraid to call the Tsar and Prime Minister executioners to their faces. A profound spiritual seeker who rejected dogmas and tried to find a universal truth in the teachings of Christ, Buddha, and Confucius. A man whose words remain so sharp today that they continue to be deemed extremist. His story is not just the biography of a writer from a school curriculum. It is the eternal, agonizing story of the choice that faces every thinking person. It is a question with no easy answer. What is more important? A comfortable, settled life within the bounds of accepted norms, or the difficult, often lonely path in harmony with one's own conscience and hard-won truth? Leo Tolstoy made his choice.